Okay, recording. Oh, fuck yeah. Right, settled. So, censorship. What is it? Where did it come from? More specifically, when was its inception with regards to the world of cinema? So, contrary to what you might expect, its origins are rooted not in the desire to help parents choose which films or TV shows are acceptable to show to their children, or to dissuade a rogue director from adding gratuitous amounts of swearing to a comedy film that was aimed at families or young adults.
Fuck you. Fuck cock. Shit.
Its roots can actually be traced as far back as early 19th century America. This video is very American Eurocentric, so my apologies. I can already hear some of you screaming at your screen saying, oh, well, cinema wasn't actually invented until the turn of the 20th century, so how could its origins be traced that? I'm saying it's simply the origins of the ideas and notions that came to inspire the perceived need for censorship that can be traced that far back, not the actual censorship of films themselves. They hadn't been invented yet, so. In order to understand and contextualize censorship, we first need to look at the socio-economic climate preceding it, and the one that it was actually birthed into. And that means winding the clock back to well before the first cinemas had opened. Just a quick side note, I was a film student. My degree didn't cover sociology or economics or politics or any of the social sciences really. This video is basically a rehashed version of my dissertation. A lot of the content I'll be talking about was totally new to me when I began researching it, and only now have I really started looking deeper into the topics within the social sciences in my free time. I could have written my thesis on why Quentin Tarantino prefers to shoot his films at a specific aspect ratio, or why J.J. Abrams chooses to add those insane digital lens flares into every single fucking shot in his movies. NANI? But instead, I chose to write about nativism, xenophobia, class stereotyping, dogmatic religious subjugation, the bourgeois attempt to suppress the will and creative expression of the proletariat through the medium of film. You know, just light, fun, film schooly stuff. And with that, why don't we get started? Long before the perceived societal problems created by the invention of the motion picture, a different threat faced the American people. This threat came in the form of alien invaders. Aliens not from another planet, of course, but from another continent. During the 1800s, a huge number of immigrants arrived from Europe. Britons, Irish, Germans, Italians, Russians, Jews, Romas, the list goes on. Many of these immigrants were refugees, such as the Irish who were desperately crossing the Atlantic to escape the Great Famine of the 1840s, or Jews who were fleeing the Russian pogroms of the 1880s. As a result, many of these people arrived in the New World almost completely penniless. Because of this, they were forced to take shelter in houses of refuge, or accept donations from charitable organizations designed to help with the influx of new settlers in the States. This was of great concern to the Native Americans. I put native here in the largest and most ironic air quotes possible. It should be noted that these Native Americans were in fact the descendants of immigrants themselves, America having been colonized by European settlers only a few hundred years prior. These natives envisioned their nation as a republic of independent, industrious workers, as historian Hidetaka Hirota has explained. Ideologically, nativism equated freedom to economic self-sufficiency. Proponents thus categorized paupers as the antithesis of American citizens. This paradigm was mirrored by the contemporary authorities also. In 1851, Mayor Luther M. Kennett of St. Louis expressed his disappointment in the lack of legislation that would allow him to make persons liable to a fine who bring us sick paupers from a distance, on steamboats and otherwise, to be taken care of by the city. A quick aside about the differences between racism, xenophobia and nativism. So all three are deeply intertwined and they often overlap, but there are some distinctions to be made. In their article, Xenophobia and Racism, authors Ronald Sunderstorm and David Hai-Kwon Kim described nativism as being distinct from the more general definition of xenophobia. Whereas xenophobia is characterized by a dislike or prejudice of foreigners, strangers, or those of different cultures, nativism is the same prejudice but employed in the supposed protection of one's nation state. Nativists also subscribe to the either one blood or one mind analogy. In this analogy, the goals of nativism can be separated into two different categories. The first, which is one blood. This category, the nativists seek to employ xenophobia to ensure purity of blood. In other words, the exclusion or the expulsion of inferior races. In this school of thought, the only way the structure and civility of their country's society can be upheld is through ensuring the population is not tainted with races inferior to the native demographic. This is analogous to racism and white supremacy. The second one, which is one mind. So in this category, nativists seek to employ xenophobia exclusively against those who have not, are unable to, or refuse to assimilate with the native culture of the country. In this example, the nativist is less concerned with nationality or race, which is one blood, but more with cultural homogeny within the country. It's their belief that only through the adoption of their country's culture and values will immigrants be able to function as productive, valued members of that society. It can be deduced from the large amount of nativist violence directed towards immigrants of all ethnic and national backgrounds, and that the nativists of the mid-1800s were more concerned with the one blood philosophy rather than the one mind. During this time, there was very little attempt to indoctrinate those of varying cultures into the American way of life. Immigrants were excluded, they were ostracized. This polarization of native and non-native culture and language caused a rift that would erupt explosively and violently during times of great change, crisis, or stress, something which is still observed to this day. In the mid-1800s, notable examples of such crises include the St. Louis election riot of 1852, the Cincinnati Election Day riot of 1855, and the Louisville Bloody Monday riot of 1855. Hostility towards immigrants during this time is clearly reflected in prison statistics. In 1850, immigrants accounted for 35.8% of the prison population, despite representing 9.7% of America's total population. In 1860, they made up 46.9% of the prison population, whilst only accounting for 13.2% of the country's overall population. This, of course, is not to say that immigrants were inherently criminal, although this narrative was peddled and believed by a great deal of the nativist American population of the time, as it still is today. This disparity was primarily caused by the fact that immigrants were, in general, much poorer than their native counterparts. Almost 40% of paupers born in 1860 were foreign-born, despite immigrants only making up 13% of the United States' total population. Those born outside of America constituted almost 47% of the prison population that same year. It's been shown throughout modern history and continuing into present day that inequality causes higher crime rates within groups and communities at the bottom of the spectrum of wealth. A contemporary comparison can be made by examining the disparity between both the average incomes of black and white Americans and their respective races' population representation in prison. In 2017, blacks accounted for 12% of the US population and whites 64%. However, blacks accounted for 33% of prison inmates while whites accounted for only 30%. This shows that black Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white Americans. Obviously, there are a whole host of contemporary systemic, socioeconomic and societal factors that still contribute to this disparity, but they're too numerous to be covered comprehensively in this video. Similarly, in 1860, the number of immigrants in prison was almost 4 times higher than the US population per capita. This trend of immigrants being viewed as and treated as criminals, thugs, and lawless hooligans continued throughout the late 1800s and into the early 20th century. And it was during this time that a new invention and subsequent form of entertainment was starting to rise rapidly in popularity and commercial success: the motion picture. During the first decade of the 20th century, the film industry flourished. In his book Effects of Censorship Pressure on the New York Nickelodeon Market, from 1907 to 1909, Robert A. Armour writes, "In New York City alone, there were more than 500 movie establishments, scattered through a wide array of neighborhoods. According to one estimate, movie theaters and storefronts exhibiting movies took in $3 million a week in 1909 and employed over 100,000 people. Some 45 million admissions a week passed through the doors of these shows." Coined nickel theaters, for their incredibly cheap tickets, These movie houses were extremely popular, especially with those of the lower class, as such entertainment simply had not been financially available to them in the past. Immigrants were still generally viewed as problem citizens who committed crimes and accounted for a high percentage of the prison population. This, coupled with the content of some early motion pictures, which was often centered around exciting topics such as murder, robbery, and racy relations, caused a great deal of concern for the elites and the middle classes alike. They were worried that the uneducated, I'll be using air quotes a lot through this video, swaths of lower class would be inspired and motivated to go out into the world and recreate what they'd witnessed on the screen. On visiting a picture house in 1907, a writer for the Chicago Tribune remarked, "The children in this place were mostly children of the poor. They were of the families of foreign labourers and formed the early stage of that dangerous second generation which is finding such a place in the criminals of the city." The same article goes on to describe the scene outside these theatres, describing with obvious distaste urchins anxious to beg enough money to get into the palaces of delight. It's falsely postulated by contemporary newspapers that the cinema was, in fact, the leading cause of crime in current times. It's apparent, however, that correlation doesn't equal causation. The fact that extreme poverty affected the lower classes was conveniently ignored. Furthermore, given that a large portion of the lower class were immigrants, as had been the case for over 100 years at that point, the introduction of the idea that a new form of media could be corrupting and criminalizing the impressionable and uneducated immigrant population reaffirmed and strengthened the nativist sentiment. Allied to this was the perceived problem of the theatres themselves. The media of the time expressed concern over the safety of theatres in the event of an emergency such as a fire. Incidents involving fires or accidents that occurred in a movie theatre were used in an attempt to tarnish the reputation of the entire industry. The Chicago Tribune wrote of one incident, "An incipient fire riot emptied one nickel theatre yesterday. The others were filled with thousands of little boys and girls. Those in the audience at the theatre at Halsted and Madison Streets were fortunate because no one was hurt seriously, but this was the result of fortune rather than of precaution of the owner." To tarnish further the image of movie theatres, the press also reported that the dimly lit interiors, combined with patrons' close proximity to one another, was a breeding ground for immoral and salacious behaviour. Movies were seen by the guardians of the old order as accelerating that trend, not just because of the questionable content, but because the new movie theatres indiscriminately mixed male and female, immigrant and native, degenerate and innocent, all in close proximity and in the dark. These rapid changes led to what sociologists call a moral panic, a time when fear causes a disproportionate reaction. It should be pointed out that while it was suggested that the conditions of the movie theatres caused a shift from moral to immoral behaviour, these same conditions also existed in traditional and vaudeville theatres, and in the case of the former had done so for many hundreds of years. The press, however, was markedly unenthusiastic to search for stories centred around indecent behaviour at such establishments. This was more an issue of class stereotyping rather than honest reporting. Surprise, surprise. The upper class attending packed events could be trusted to behave appropriately in the dark, unlike the lower immigrant classes. Of course, the church objected to these new establishments in unison with the ruling class and the press. The notion of protecting the innocent minds of children was also a central point in the discourse about the motion picture. A headline, again from the Chicago Tribune, read, "Investigation of 5-cent playhouses proves corrupt tendency of performances on young." The article fails to cite which study it's referring to or provide any evidence to substantiate its claim. Later, the article quotes from a pastor's sermon in which he addresses the city's mayor. Will he cooperate in preventing the suggestive performances at the cheap theatres which are riddling the morals of boys? Will he cooperate in preventing the 5-cent movie theatres which flourish through teaching crime to children? This is of civic interest and not a question of church and denomination. Roman Catholic and Protestant will work hand in hand with a prospect of success if Mayor Busey will give his assurance of personal effort. This stands for good citizenship, now and to come. Another important reason for the censoring and regulation of films in the eyes of the press and the elites was to prevent the public from being subject to, air quotes again, radical ideologies. By radical ideologies, they refer to socialist, communist, anarchist, or really any left-leaning points of view. Anything really outside the scope of good old-fashioned bootstrapping capitalism.